He got rich by destroying the forest and thought that the past was behind him. But one day, his ex-wife went looking for evidence and ended up in the hands of the people he himself had hired. A little dark-skinned girl witnessed the attack and decided to call him. That call changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Leonard's house stood alone on a low ridge above the tree line, its broad windows reflecting the muted silver of the morning sky. To anyone passing by, it looked like the dwelling of a man who had conquered his world. Modern angles of glass and timber, a driveway wide enough for several cars, lights that came on automatically each evening like a quiet announcement of wealth. Inside, however, the space was hollow in a way money could not disguise. The echo of his footsteps on the polished floors reminded him every day that he lived alone. For years, Leonard had built his empire by treating the forest as a ledger of numbers. Trees were not living organisms to him, but units of inventory. His company cut, processed, exported, and grew rich from a trade that reached far beyond the small town that surrounded the woods. At corporate events, he was praised as a visionary who turned natural resources into economic strength. He had learned to speak the language of jobs and growth, the words people wanted to hear when they worried about paying bills. Yet in quiet moments, when the emails stopped and the night pressed against the glass, an emptiness crept in. He told himself it was just fatigue. In truth, it was something heavier, a silence that had settled after he had driven away the one person who had once believed in him as more than a businessman. Years earlier, his marriage to Emily had felt like a fire that would burn forever. She had been a journalist before she became an environmental researcher, a woman of tireless curiosity and moral clarity. Where Leonard saw profit and risk management, Emily saw soil and water and the invisible threads that tied people to the land. She had stood in the same room where investors toasted his success and asked who would pay for the poisoned creeks, for the thinning of bird calls at dawn, for the slow dying of moss and ferns. At first, he dismissed her concerns with the smooth arguments he had mastered. Sustainability initiatives, replanting programs, clean manufacturing claims. But Emily was not swayed by polished reports. She looked deeper, and what she found, the quiet use of chemicals to speed decomposition, the secret dumping of waste, she brought home with the fury of someone who could not pretend not to know. Their love cracked under the strain. One night she packed her notebooks and left, saying she could not stay with a man who built his future on destroying what she loved. Leonard had watched her car tail lights vanish down the drive and told himself she would regret it. Instead, it was he who carried regret like an invisible weight. Emily had not gone far. She had chosen a small cottage near the edge of the same woods Leonard's company claimed as its territory. From there, she began her own quiet war, hiking out at dawn with jars, vials, and a battered camera, collecting samples of water where fish floated belly up, scraping soil from stumps blackened with unmarked chemicals, recording the disappearance of orchids and fungi that once thrived under the old growth. Money was scarce. Friends offered what they could, but many drifted away, tired of her relentless cause. Yet she stayed, fueled by a belief that truth mattered, even when no one seemed to listen. At night, when wind rattled the windows, she sometimes feared the men she knew patrolled the forest on behalf of Leonard's contractors. Fear, however, never outweighed purpose. Not far from her cottage lived Zara, a girl of 10 with an alert, hungry mind. She shared a small, weathered house with her mother and little brother. Life was not easy for them. Her mother worked double shifts at the local diner and still worried about rent. Yet she raised her children with quiet dignity and the insistence that learning was a form of survival. Zara adored the woods. She spent hours crouched over anthills, sketching birds, tracing veins on fallen leaves. When she first saw Emily one early morning, tall boots splashed with mud, hair tied back under a faded cap, moving with purpose deeper into the trees. Zara felt a pull stronger than caution. Here was someone who understood the language of the forest. Bit by bit, Zara began following. She was careful, stepping where the ground was soft and quiet, holding her breath when branches threatened to snap. She watched Emily kneel by streams, dip small tubes into water, scrape bark from wounded trees. Sometimes the woman would pause and look around, but she never saw the small shadow trailing at a distance. To Zara, it was like having a secret window into a larger, braver world. Emily became her silent hero, proof that a person could stand up to something big and wrong, even when alone. The forest itself was changing. In Zara's short life, she had seen patches of green turn to raw stumps, creeks that once ran clear, now clouded and lifeless. In recent months, new signs appeared. Private property in bold red letters nailed to trunks, and trucks with tinted windows rumbling down paths where children once played. Men in dark uniforms patrolled now, tall and unsmiling. They yelled at berry pickers, threatened hikers, and carried themselves as if the land were theirs alone. Zara had watched one such encounter where they scared off a family collecting mushrooms. Something about the cold efficiency of those men left her uneasy, though she could not yet name why. She thought about Emily whenever she saw them, and wondered if the woman knew how dangerous they might be. Leonard, meanwhile, remained blind to the daily reality his business created. In boardrooms and private calls, he approved strategies to accelerate harvest, including a quiet expansion of chemical treatments that broke down dead wood faster for transport. Reports of environmental damage were either buried or reframed as acceptable collateral for progress. To him, the patrols were a necessary precaution against trespassers, who might sue if injured. Yet there were moments, fleeting, unwelcome. When he paused at his office window, staring toward the dark line of forest, and felt a pang of something he refused to name. Perhaps it was the echo of Emily's voice, asking, once, if profit would ever be enough to fill a life. Emily worked harder with each season, aware that proof alone might not bring change, but determined to gather it anyway. Her notebooks grew thick with data, maps marked with red X's, where trees sickened and streams ran black, photos of dying saplings and bone-dry moss. She had submitted reports to small independent outlets, but few cared to fight a company as powerful as Leonard's. Still, she pressed on, because stopping would mean surrendering the only weapon she had: persistence. Zara saw more than anyone realized. She knew when Emily returned exhausted, but quietly triumphant, with a new vial of cloudy water. She saw the woman scrub chemical burns from her hands in the yard. She learned to keep secrets. Even her mother did not know how often she slipped away to watch. To Zara, Emily was a kind of storybook heroine come to life alone, clever and brave against a faceless giant. Yet heroes, she began to sense, could bleed. As summer slid into a heavy late season, the air thick with the scent of cut pine and distant smoke, the tension in the forest deepened. The trucks roared louder. More signs went up. Zara began to feel a prickle of fear each time she followed Emily, though it never stopped her. Something told her a storm was gathering, though she could not guess what shape it might take. One overcast morning, Leonard stood on his balcony with coffee cooling in his hand. The horizon was muted green and gray, and a hawk wheeled high above the treetops. He thought, unbidden, of Emily somewhere out there among those trees. He wondered if she still hated him, or if hate required a closeness they no longer had. The thought left him unsettled. He shook it away and turned back to his phone, where numbers and plans awaited. unaware that the choices he had made were about to collide with the life he had tried so hard to leave behind. Far below, along a narrow dirt track threading between towering firs, Emily stepped deeper into territory she had never dared before. Her pack was heavier than usual, filled with sterile jars, testing strips, and a small camera she had saved months to buy. She walked quickly, scanning for signs of illegal dumping. The forest was unnaturally silent, and somewhere in that silence, unseen, a child followed at a distance, heart thrumming with excitement and a hint of dread. Zara did not know it yet, but she was walking toward the moment when her small voice would have to rise against a world that believed it could not be heard. The forest held its breath, and so, in a way, did all of their lives, suspended on the edge of what none of them yet knew was coming. The sky hung low and heavy the morning Emily set out again, a pale veil of mist drifting through the canopy, as if the forest itself were uncertain whether to wake. She had slept poorly, restless, with a sense that time was running out. Too many reports had gone unanswered, too many doors had closed in her face, and yet the signs of damage were growing clearer with each passing week. Streams she had once tested ran thicker with chemical sheen. Frogs that used to scatter at her footsteps were gone. It felt as though something terrible was happening quietly, out of sight, and that she was the only one still willing to look. Her backpack was heavier than usual, filled with clean sample jars, testing strips, a portable water analyzer, and the small camera she had spent months saving for. This part of the forest, beyond the new warning signs and the crude steel gates, was the heart of what Leonard's company now controlled. Satellite images had hinted at large clearings and suspicious pools of standing water. If she could bring back undeniable proof, maybe the small network of journalists she still knew could make someone listen. She zipped her jacket tight, tucked her hair under a faded cap, and stepped off the narrow trail into damp undergrowth. The silence was oppressive, not the gentle hush she loved, but a strained stillness, as if birds and insects alike were holding back. Unseen behind her, a smaller set of footsteps echoed in cautious rhythm. Zara had woken early, too, drawn by that same pull she always felt when she saw Emily leave. Her mother was still asleep, exhausted after the night shift, and her little brother snored softly in their shared room. Zara slipped out with the skill of a child used to moving quietly. Curiosity was stronger than fear, though fear nipped at her heels as she followed the faint crunch of Emily's boots. She had never trailed this far before, but something in the woman's purposeful stride told her today mattered. Emily reached the first clearing as the light grew. What had once been dense pines now lay as a scar. Stumps jagged and splintered, piles of brush left to rot, tire tracks pressed deep into wet soil. She knelt, scooping earth into a small jar, marking coordinates in her notebook. The ground smelled of fuel and decay. A few hundred meters beyond, she found the creek she had suspected was contaminated. Its water ran dull gray, slick with an iridescent film. She filled vials, tested pH, and recorded the readings with a sinking heart. It was worse than she feared. She was about to move deeper when she caught the low rumble of an engine. Her breath tightened. Trucks had come and gone before, but she had managed to stay unseen. This time, the sound was closer, deliberate. She crouched behind a fallen log, clutching her camera. 2 vehicles rolled into the clearing, dark pickups with company logos she recognized all too well. 4 men climbed out. They weren't dressed like simple forestry workers. Their boots were heavy, their jackets black, and one of them carried a radio clipped to his shoulder. Emily felt the instinct to run, but forced herself still. If she could wait them out, maybe they'd pass. But they didn't pass. One man spotted the disturbed mud where she had knelt. His head snapped up, A sharp gesture brought the others. They fanned out quickly, trained eyes sweeping the undergrowth. Emily's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She turned to slip away, but her boot slid on slick moss. The faint noise was enough. A shout tore through the clearing, and then they were coming. She bolted, crashing through brush, but they were faster. Branches whipped her face, and she stumbled over a root. A hand seized her backpack, yanking her backward so violently she fell hard onto her side. Before she could scramble up, another man was there, wrenching her arms behind her. Her camera skittered across the mud and was crushed under a boot. A rough voice barked something she didn't catch over the roar in her ears. Tape or cord? She couldn't see bit into her wrists. One of them kicked her bag aside and rifled through the samples, laughing when a jar broke and soaked the ground with polluted water. Fear flared bright, but so did anger. Emily twisted and fought, but a fist to her stomach knocked the breath out of her. She doubled over, gagging. Another blow came across her cheek. The men weren't just here to chase her off. They wanted to make sure she didn't come back. One leaned close, his face hidden under a cap, and hissed a threat she barely heard, though its meaning was unmistakable. She had crossed a line, and now she would pay. Zara had frozen when the trucks appeared, pressing herself against the trunk of a cedar, heart hammering so loudly she was certain they would hear it. She watched in horror as the men swarmed Emily. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She had never seen adults hurt someone like that outside of a movie. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but another voice, quieter and fiercer, told her she couldn't just let this happen. She wanted to yell, to throw rocks, anything, but she knew she would be next. She crouched low, trembling, and backed away step by careful step until she was far enough to turn and sprint. Branches scratched her arms and legs as she fled. Her chest burned, but she didn't stop. By the time she reached the edge of town, her lungs were on fire, and tears streaked her face. At home, the house was still quiet, her mother asleep. Zara didn't dare wake her. She knew adults sometimes dismissed what kids said. She needed someone who could act now. Emily had once mentioned Leonard's name, almost bitterly, when explaining why the company was so powerful. Zara had listened and remembered. Rich, important, connected. Maybe dangerous, but maybe able to stop this. She grabbed the family's old tablet, fingers shaking as she typed. Leonard's name brought up the company website, glossy and cold. A number for media inquiries glowed on the screen. It felt impossible that anyone would answer, but she pressed call. The line rang 3 times before a deep voice came on. She blurted everything. The woods, the trucks, the men hurting Emily. The place where the creek turned silver and foul. Her words tumbled over each other, breathless and high-pitched. The man interrupted once, confused, but she kept going, painting every detail she had seen, the broken camera, the black jackets, the sound of Emily crying out. At last there was silence on the other end. She feared the call had dropped. Then the voice spoke again, slower now, asking her to repeat where exactly she was. She did. He asked how long ago it happened. She told him. In his office, miles away, Leonard had been halfway through reviewing a new contract. When the call came through his assistant as a direct transfer, "There's a kid on the line, says it's urgent." Normally, he would have brushed it off, but something about the raw panic in that young voice reached past his defenses. At first, he suspected a prank or an activist ploy. Yet as the girl described the scene, so specific, so vivid, something shifted. He knew the site she spoke of. He recognized the tactics his contracted security might use, but never imagined they would escalate to beating a woman he once loved. A strange cold settled over him, part rage, part fear. For years he had signed off on decisions thinking of balance sheets and shareholder calls, believing he could control the sharp edges of the work from a distance. Now the distance collapsed. He saw Emily in his mind, as she had been years ago, determined, unyielding, alive with purpose, and imagined her bound and bleeding in the mud because of men who answered, however indirectly, to him. The thought broke something he hadn't known was still intact. He didn't call his head of security. He didn't summon lawyers or PR teams. He simply grabbed his keys and left. As he drove the long forest road, his hands clenched the wheel so tightly, his knuckles whitened. Each mile stripped away layers of denial he had worn like armor. For the first time, profit and control seemed flimsy compared to the immediate, human reality of harm. The voice of the child echoed in his head, afraid but brave enough to act when adults failed. Back in the woods, the men who had taken Emily deeper off the trail argued quietly among themselves. She could hear pieces through the haze of pain, whether to let her go, whether someone might have seen. One paced and cursed, clearly nervous. Another suggested finishing what they started, but the leader hesitated. Emily sensed their uncertainty but was too weak to exploit it. Her wrists burned from the bindings. Her face throbbed where the blows had landed. She closed her eyes, thinking of the forest and how it deserved better than this, and wondered if anyone would know what happened when she didn't return. She didn't yet know that help was already coming, carried on the momentum of a frightened but determined child who refused to stay silent. Nor did Leonard, speeding through the morning haze, realize how irrevocably this day would fracture the life he thought he controlled. For now, there was only the road unspooling beneath his tires and the gathering weight of choices catching up to him at last. Leonard drove as though the forest might slip away if he didn't reach it in time. Gravel spat from under his tires, and the canopy closed overhead like a warning. The mist that had hung earlier thickened into a dim haze between the trees, and he felt for the first time in years that he was not in control of anything. Each bend of the road seemed to push him deeper into the very land he had spent his life treating as a ledger. When the signal on his phone died, a pulse of unease ran through him. He was alone with the consequences of choices made long ago. The trucks appeared before he expected them, parked haphazardly across a clearing. Men in black jackets stood near one of them, smoking and muttering. They looked up as his car crunched to a stop, and surprise flickered across their faces before being masked by stiff professionalism. They hadn't expected him. One stepped forward, beginning some explanation, but Leonard didn't listen. His gaze had already locked on Emily. She was kneeling in the mud, hands bound behind her, face swollen where someone had struck her. Her camera lay shattered nearby, and broken glass glittered faintly in the weak light. For a heartbeat, Leonard couldn't move. Memories he had buried under board meetings and stock forecasts flooded back. Emily laughing in rain-soaked boots when they were young. Emily shouting at him across their kitchen when she first discovered what his company was doing to the streams. He had always thought she was dramatic, reckless. Now she was small and shaking, and it was his empire that had put her here. He stepped out of the car, his shoes sinking slightly into damp ground. The men shifted uneasily, waiting for instruction. Leonard didn't yell. His voice came out cold and flat, the kind of tone that had once made subordinates scramble. He ordered them to cut her loose. No one dared refuse. The man with the knife glanced at the others, then bent to slice the bindings. Emily sagged forward but caught herself before she fell completely. Leonard moved closer, wanting to help but hesitating, as if unsure of his right to touch her. When her wrists were free, Emily turned her face toward him. There was no gratitude there, only exhaustion and a wary, defiant stare. He saw pain but also something harder, an unbroken will. For a moment neither spoke. Then Leonard turned on the men, demanding explanations. Their words tumbled out. She was trespassing, gathering evidence, making trouble. They had only meant to scare her. The excuses sounded brittle even to their own ears. Leonard cut them off with a single furious command to leave. Engines roared as the trucks backed away, the men vanishing into the trees, glancing over shoulders, as if unsure whether the true danger now came from him. When they were gone, silence returned, heavy and unsteady. Leonard crouched beside Emily. He reached out, stopped short, then finally placed a tentative hand on her shoulder. "Come on," he said quietly, though his throat felt tight. She didn't resist when he helped her to her feet. She was trembling from cold and shock, but stood as tall as she could, refusing to appear defeated. They moved slowly toward his car, each step through mud, an echo of years of distance between them. He didn't drive her back to town. Instead, he turned onto an older road few used now, one that led to a hunting cabin his father had once kept. The cabin was rough, but intact, hidden deep where no patrols roamed. Emily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, silent except for the occasional sharp inhale when pain flared. Leonard glanced at her hands. Raw and abraded, and felt something in himself splinter. These were wounds his wealth had bought, whether he'd ordered them or not. The cabin smelled of dust and old pine when they entered. Leonard moved quickly, finding bottled water, a threadbare blanket, a first aid kit long untouched. He worked awkwardly, washing blood from her face, wrapping gauze around her wrists. She didn't thank him. She simply allowed it, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the room. When he finally stepped back, hands unsteady, he tried to speak, but nothing came out at first. Years of pride and rationalization tangled on his tongue. Emily broke the silence. Her voice was hoarse but steady. She told him about the chemicals, the evidence she'd collected, the maps and samples showing how his company's shortcuts were poisoning soil and streams beyond repair. She spoke without heat, just a quiet, relentless clarity that left no space for denial. Leonard listened, because he couldn't not. The numbers he had trusted to justify everything seemed meaningless compared to the sight of her bruises and the calm precision of her words. Each fact was a nail pried from the coffin of excuses he had built. When she finished, she opened her battered pack. Somehow, despite the attack, she had saved part of her work. Notebooks sealed in plastic, a flash drive tucked deep inside, a few unbroken vials. She laid them out on the table, as if presenting evidence to a jury. Leonard stared at them, feeling a sick mixture of admiration and shame. He realized she had fought this battle almost entirely alone, while he had turned away and called it business. Night fell slowly, shadows creeping across the cabin walls. Neither of them lit the old lantern for a long while. They sat with only the fading glow through the windows. Leonard thought about the patrols he'd approved, the memos he'd signed without reading closely, the bonuses tied to increased yield. It had all seemed abstract, a game of markets and margins. Now the abstraction had a face, swollen and bruised, a woman who once believed in him. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that his empire might not just be careless, it might be cruel. Emily seemed beyond anger. What burned in her now was resolve. She explained her plan: gather enough undeniable proof to force the government's hand, to bring journalists and regulators to the forest before it was too late. She didn't ask for his help. She didn't expect it. Leonard sensed she saw him as part of the machine she was fighting. But somewhere in his chest, something stirred, a flicker of the man he might have been if he'd chosen differently long ago. A soft knock startled them both. Leonard tensed, fearing the men had returned. But when he opened the door, he found only a small figure standing in the dark. Zara clutched a glass jar filled with clear water and a crumpled drawing. Her eyes were huge with both fear and determination. She had followed, somehow, or maybe guessed where Emily might be. The sight of the child jolted Emily upright. Zara stammered that she wanted to help, that she had brought water from near her home where the stream still ran clear, that maybe it could be tested. She handed over the jar with shaking hands, and the drawing a picture of trees and birds, colored with hope more than accuracy. Emily took the gifts carefully, her battered hands trembling. For the first time that day, her face softened. Leonard stood back, watching this quiet exchange, and felt an unfamiliar humility. This child had done what he had not, seen wrong and acted without hesitation. Zara looked up at him warily, aware perhaps that he was the man behind the machines. But she did not shrink. There was no fear in her gaze now, only expectation. Leonard spent the long night awake by the cold hearth. Emily slept fitfully on the couch, bandaged and exhausted. Zara curled up on a chair too big for her, stubbornly refusing to leave despite Leonard's offer to drive her home. He stared at them both and saw, perhaps for the first time, the stark divide between the life he had built and the life he might still choose. He thought of profits and contracts, of the board that would revolt if he stepped out of line, of the years spent building walls around his conscience. And yet none of that seemed as solid as the image of a child's trembling call cutting through his day, forcing him here. By dawn, he knew the quiet could not last. His company would hear about what happened. The men he'd sent away would scramble to protect themselves, maybe to spin the story before it reached anyone else. Regulators could be bought, journalists silenced, but the truth now sat in his cabin on a table covered with mud-stained notebooks and vials of poisoned water. He also knew that Emily, bruised but unbroken, would not stop even if he abandoned her again. And he, for the first time in decades, was not sure he wanted to abandon her. When Emily woke, Leonard was at the window, staring into the misty green beyond. She studied him silently, perhaps trying to gauge whether the man she once loved was still buried somewhere under the years of profit and betrayal. He turned at last and met her gaze. No words passed, but something heavier than apology moved between them, a recognition of damage done and of a possible path, narrow and treacherous, toward making some piece of it right. Zara stirred and rubbed her eyes, suddenly small again in the morning light. Leonard looked at her and felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. This child had carried the truth through fear. He could not let that courage fall into silence. He offered her breakfast with an awkward gentleness, and she smiled shyly, a brief flicker of normalcy amid the weight of everything. Outside, the forest exhaled a damp breath of pine and earth. For years, Leonard had seen it only as timber. Now it felt alive, almost watchful, as though it had been waiting for this reckoning. He did not yet know exactly what he would do, only that the life he had led could not continue unchanged. Emily's fight had reached him despite all his walls. Zara's bravery had shamed him into action. The truth could no longer be buried under contracts and guards. He felt the first faint stirrings of resolve, fragile, untested, but real. The empire he built might collapse if he turned against it, but perhaps some things mattered more than survival and wealth. Perhaps it was not too late to stand on the side of what was living rather than what destroyed. He knew the road ahead would be brutal. Lawsuits, betrayal from his own executives, public scorn. But for the first time, he saw that silence would cost even more. Behind him, Emily closed her notebook and looked up. She didn't smile, but there was the barest flicker of acknowledgement, as if she sensed a shift in him she dared not trust yet. Leonard nodded once, a small gesture heavy with unspoken intent. Zara, oblivious to the adult gravity but sensing some truce, began drawing again, filling the page with trees greener than any that stood outside. The image made Leonard's chest tighten. The day moved on slowly, and with it came an unspoken pact. The fight was no longer Emily's alone. The man who had once turned his back on her cause now understood, in the rawest way possible, that his choices had teeth. The forest had shown him its truth. Guilt had carved a path toward something like redemption. And though none of them yet knew how they would face what came next, they all felt the same quiet certainty. The battle for this land and for their own integrity had only just begun. The morning after the long, sleepless night in the cabin came pale and cold, a thin veil of fog curling through the trees, as if the forest itself were uncertain whether to trust the sudden change stirring among those who had trespassed on it for so long. Leonard stood outside on the small porch, hands gripping the railing, staring into the quiet green. The weight in his chest was unlike any he had carried in the decades of building his empire. It was heavier, more honest, stripped of the easy comfort of numbers. Inside, Emily moved slowly, but with renewed determination, bandaging her wrists again, arranging the salvaged notes and vials on the table, as if preparing for battle. Zara slept curled in an armchair too big for her, one hand still resting on the edge of her drawing. The fragile peace of the cabin felt like a pause between storms. Leonard knew that by returning to his house and office, he would step back into a world that expected him to defend what he had built. The board would demand explanations. Lawyers would advise silence. Public relations teams would craft statements to protect profit and reputation. But he also knew that the sight of Emily bound in the mud and the courage of a child who refused to stay quiet had changed something that would not be undone. He had seen the cost of his power laid bare, and there was no refuge now in denial. Emily joined him on the porch, moving carefully, her face still bruised, but her gaze unbroken. They didn't speak for a long time. The silence between them felt different than the years of estrangement that had followed their divorce. It was no longer a gulf filled with anger and misunderstanding, but a quiet acknowledgement that the future would require both of them, each from their own wounded place. When she finally spoke, it was only to say that she intended to continue her work, that she would not let fear stop her now. Leonard nodded slowly. He didn't ask her to forgive him, because he understood that forgiveness was not something he could request. It would have to be earned, if it ever came at all. He offered to drive Zara home, but the girl refused with the calm stubbornness of someone who had already crossed a threshold. She wanted to stay until she knew Emily was safe. Emily smiled faintly at that, and even Leonard felt a flicker of warmth. There was something profoundly humbling in the way a 10-year-old had faced danger with more clarity than most adults. It reminded him of the man he might have been once, before ambition and fear dulled his sense of responsibility. By midday, Leonard left the cabin for a few hours, promising to return. He needed to confront what he had created. The drive back to his headquarters felt surreal, as if the polished roads and sleek office towers belonged to another lifetime. He entered the building without speaking to anyone and climbed to the top floor where the boardroom waited. The directors were already gathering, having heard rumors of a disturbance in the forest. Their faces shifted from confusion to alarm as Leonard walked in, mud-streaked and grim. He did not sit. He spoke. He told them what had happened, not with legal precision but with raw truth. He described finding Emily bound and beaten by men they had hired. He described the chemicals, the poisoned creeks, the quiet suffering of the land, and the people who lived beside it. He told them of the little girl who had called him because no one else would help. Some of the board members tried to interrupt, to warn him about liability, but Leonard kept going until the room was silent. For once, he did not wield numbers or projections. He wielded the moral weight of what they had done. And then he told them his decision. The company would end its most destructive practices, release its environmental data publicly, and support independent investigation. If they chose to fire him for it, so be it. He would no longer be the man who hid behind profit while others bled. The shock was palpable. Some threatened legal action. Others whispered about financial ruin. But a few, perhaps moved, or perhaps simply pragmatic, said nothing and watched. Leonard didn't wait for their approval. He walked out, leaving a silence heavy enough to fracture the polished air behind him. From there, he drove not to his mansion, but to a small regional press office where Emily had once freelanced. He called Emily from the parking lot, voice steady but quieter than she had ever heard it. He asked if she wanted to stand beside him when he spoke to the public. She hesitated, wary of being used for spectacle, but something in his tone, stripped of arrogance, almost pleading for the chance to set things right, convinced her. She and Zara arrived later that day, Emily still bruised, Zara clutching her drawings as if they were shields. The press conference was unlike anything the town had seen. Leonard, the man long known for ruthless efficiencies and polished charm, stood before cameras with no prepared statement, no glossy backdrop. Beside him stood Emily, visibly battered but upright, and a shy little girl who had insisted on being present. Leonard spoke plainly. He admitted the company's harm, named the secret dumping sites, promised to shut down the most damaging operations, and pledged resources to restore what could be saved. He acknowledged Emily's work and bravery, and said that the truth should never have required her suffering or a child's fear to come to light. He looked into the cameras and said he was sorry. The room erupted afterward. Reporters shouted questions. Some were skeptical, others astonished. Social media exploded with images: the wounded environmentalist, the remorseful magnate, and the solemn child at their side. Some called it a calculated performance. Others called it the first crack of accountability in an industry long untouchable. Lawsuits began within days. Regulators announced investigations. Investors panicked and withdrew. But amid the chaos, there was also an outpouring of support from small communities living near the forests, from environmental groups long ignored, from ordinary people moved by the sight of a man confronting the harm he had done. Emily, though wary of being co-opted, found herself suddenly amplified. Journalists who had dismissed her now sought interviews. Scientists offered help analyzing her data. Her years of lonely fieldwork became evidence too loud to dismiss. She accepted the attention not for herself, but for the cause she had almost died defending. When asked about Leonard, she was careful. She said only that he had finally listened, and that actions, not words, would determine whether his change meant anything. Zara became an unexpected symbol. News outlets wanted the story of the brave little girl who had called the powerful man to save someone in danger. She was shy in front of cameras, but when asked why she acted, she said simply that she didn't want someone to die when she could help. A clip of her saying those words, eyes wide but steady, voice small but clear spread everywhere. People shared it as proof that courage did not depend on age or status. Schools invited her to speak. Environmental groups sent books and small science kits. Emily and Leonard worried about the weight of attention on someone so young, but Zara's mother stood firmly by her side, making sure she stayed a child even while being recognized as a hero. For Leonard, the weeks that followed were both punishing and strangely liberating. His wealth shrank as contracts dissolved and stockholders fled, but he felt lighter than he had in years. He sold properties to fund cleanup efforts and set up a foundation in Emily's name to support independent environmental research and legal protection for activists. He did not try to return to the man he had been before. Success hardened him. Instead, he began the harder work of becoming someone new. The path was lonely and often brutal, but it was real. Emily did not move back into his life, nor did she want to. They remained separate but connected, allies now rather than enemies. There were moments when they stood together at a restoration site, watching young trees being planted where wasteland had been, and shared a silent understanding. Some bonds could not be remade, but they could be honored with honesty. Zara thrived in her quiet way. She visited Emily often, learning how to test water, how to observe ecosystems, how to keep records that could stand up to scrutiny. Leonard funded programs for local children to explore the forest and learn about protecting it. One afternoon, Emily took Zara to a newly cleared stream where frogs had begun to return. The girl crouched at the water's edge, dipping a test strip with practiced hands, and smiled when it showed improvement. Leonard watched from a distance, not wanting to intrude, but unable to hide the small, proud smile tugging at his own face. The world moved on, as it always does, but something had shifted. The company that once seemed untouchable was now under watchful eyes. Other corporations took notice, if only out of fear. Communities found courage to question what had been done to their land. And somewhere deep in the forest, where the air smelled of wet pine and earth rather than chemicals, hope began to take root again. For Leonard, redemption remained an unfinished, fragile thing. He knew he could never undo all the harm, but he also knew that silence would have been worse. He had listened too late to save everything, yet not too late to change himself. He thought often of that moment, when a child's trembling voice reached him through the phone, cutting through years of ambition. It had been small but unstoppable, like a seed-cracking stone. Emily continued her work, now with support and protection she had never imagined. She still walked the forest with her pack and her quiet determination. Sometimes she and Leonard crossed paths among the trees. They exchanged nods that carried more weight than words, acknowledgement of a past full of pain and a future that might, if tended carefully, hold something better. Zara grew taller, her curiosity only deepening. On her 12th birthday, Emily and Leonard presented her with a sturdy field kit microscope, test strips, waterproof notebook. Zara's face lit with joy, and she ran into the trees, calling back that she was going to find proof of frogs returning. Her laughter drifted through the branches like a promise. As evening fell on the forest that had witnessed betrayal, courage, and reluctant redemption, Leonard stood once more on the cabin porch. He listened to the sounds returning, the hum of insects, the distant call of an owl, and felt something close to peace. Not absolution, not yet, but the beginning of it. He thought of Emily, of Zara, of the day he chose truth over comfort. For the first time, the empire he had lost did not matter. What mattered was this quiet, living place, and the knowledge that a single brave act, one woman's persistence, one child's phone call, could turn even a hardened man toward the light. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from.